Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Ask Olaf the Violin Maker. Today I'm going to respond to one of Brett and Eddie's recent videos about the dark secrets of the violin industry.
That is some of the unethical practices that happen in selling musical instruments.
I'd love to share my experiences as a violin maker. Now I have to say here, I have never paid a commission to a teacher. I have been asked for a commission once, and I'll tell that story later, but I'll also tell you the story of how I first found out about this commission system, and yeah, it was definitely a bit of a frustrating experience.
International phenomenon of a secret commission system. It's kind of hard when doing research about this to find statistical evidence because so much of this is underground and just hearing stories.
So anyway, the first time I came across this commission system was many years ago. I think it was maybe 25 years ago or something like that. And I was working together with my brother. We had a shop, you know, at that time I'd had 10 years of violin making experience. I'd learned with my father, who's a German master violin maker. I also learned at a shop in Germany where I worked with a lot of masters. But the masters that I worked with in this shop in Germany were just unbelievable. They were some of the best makers and restorers in the world. So I was very lucky. So anyway, you know, back in Australia, my brother and I had just opened a new business, and you know, we're making some inroad. And then basically one time a student had tried out some instruments with us. They'd found one violin that was just perfect for them. And what made it so perfect, firstly, it was really easy to play, and it had a beautiful big sound. It just made them a better player. And the student absolutely loved the instrument. It was fantastic. So we gave that instrument to the student to try. And then, you know, they tried it for a week, and they came back at the end of the week and they said, yeah, I decided to buy another instrument. And we found out later that the teacher had strongly recommended that they get a different instrument. Now, as it is in the violin making world, you know, those instruments eventually come to us, and that instrument needed some work, and it turned out that it was overpriced. It wasn't exactly what it said it was on the label, and there were a lot of problems with the instrument that didn't have a clear sound. It was hard to play, and the player didn't actually, you know, they didn't like it as much as the other one. But the teacher strongly recommended that they buy this instrument. They said, you know, you will grow with this instrument. You know, when you become a better player, that instrument will really work for you. And so they got persuaded and ended up buying this inferior instrument. And personally, my heart just broke, because this was a talented violinist, and you know, and they ended up with an instrument that wasn't going to work for them. It could basically ruin their entire chance of a career. Because when you're doing an audition for an orchestra and your instrument doesn't sound that good, even though you're quite a good player, that can take away, you know, if it's very close between 2 or 3 players, the player with the inferior sounding instrument may just lose out by that much. And not because of their playing, it's just because of the way the playing came across. And that's why I was so frustrated. And also, you know, I just love players to have really good quality and really good value instruments. And I'm passionate about supporting string players, and to see this happen just made me really sad. You know, this has happened to me quite a lot over the years. So I'd get quite close to someone buying an instrument, and especially the instrument that I sell them, I make sure that they tick the 7 essentials. By the way, if you'd like the 7 essentials, I put a link down in the description. So anyway, it had all the 7 essentials, you know, good quality workmanship, great quality instrument, easy to play, great sound, and the player had to love the instrument, and that's something that I can't necessarily help with. But all the other essentials, I really make sure that my instruments tick all those boxes. So this was just so frustrating for me. So this happens For me, it happens, 2 or 3 times a year that I miss out on a sale for that reason. And I personally don't mind. I'm not attached to the sales. For me, it's all about providing the players with really good instruments. And okay, I might be a little bit disappointed if they didn't pick my instrument over another one. But if that other instrument, if they love that other instrument and it ticks all the boxes, go for it, because you've got to find the right instrument for you. And if it's not in my shop, it's in someone else's shop. But when you start getting these unfair advantages, that's when things get a bit worrisome. Now, don't get me wrong. Most teachers I know are super ethical. They have the very best interest of their students in mind. They really try and take care and nurture their students. I know so many amazing teachers, and they are the backbone of string playing. Without teachers, it just wouldn't get passed on. So teachers are so important. I really appreciate them. And I'm in this video, I'm not saying that all teachers are bad. There is only very few that actually do decide to take commission and make some extra money. And also, I do have to say that not all teachers get paid all that well. Some school teachers' jobs, they kind of have average pay. So a little bit of help wouldn't be all that bad. But I do have some solutions for this. What I did want to share one other story about how much power teachers have. And there was one mum that came in and she knew nothing about instruments. And so she took her teacher's word for everything. And the teacher said, your girl needs a 3/4 size violin. Get her a 3/4 size. It's a bit big, but if it's a bit big, she was 8 years old actually. If it's a big, she'll grow into it. I checked a 3/4 size violin on this girl and it was ridiculously large. And I highly recommend, so the half size violin was just a tiny bit large for her, but was perfect. And so I convinced her to make sure that, have the best interest of the girl in mind and buy the half size violin. The next day she brought it back and she said, no, my teacher said, get a 3/4 size. I have 35 years experience working with string players. I know when an instrument is the right size. I also know what can happen if players play the wrong instrument and struggle and get a tense posture. I personally have seen, really amazing string players have to give up because of RSI or tennis elbow related injuries. And that's just so sad, like the whole career gone, of some really amazing players. So this story shows how much power teachers actually have. And I work with some teachers who really, who really appreciate my skill and my professional background, and it really allow me to work with their student to find the best instruments. The teacher always ends up ticking off on the instrument at the end. They just want to make sure that the student made a good decision. But for me, that's so much, I really enjoy helping string players find a good quality instrument. But anyway, back to the commissions. So one time I had a teacher and, I did a bit of work and the instrument that he had was shocking. And it turned out that it was for sale at an inflated price. So he was asking me to value it, and it was one of those really shady instruments. By the way, watch my video on fake labels because, that's a whole other story. But this instrument was scary. And so he had me do some work on it, and then he said, oh, do you sell instruments? And yes, I do. And I showed him some, and he proceeded to put down my instruments. But, I can handle it. But, if you like the instrument that he actually had, it was it was in a terrible condition. It's one of those German instruments that had been to Eastern Europe and then had the full revarnish, relabel, and just to make it look like something bigger and better, and it was just shocking. It had about 20 repaired cracks on the top plate, and it really wasn't in a good condition. So he said, oh, do you sell any instruments? And then he said, And he said, and I said, yes, yeah, I've got lots of instruments. And he goes, oh, do you pay commission? And I said, no, I don't do that. Oh, but you know that we play such a big part in your sale. You know, you should really pay a commission. I said, yeah, look, that's not really fair to the player because you know they don't get their choice. Oh yeah, but we really help the player, you know, and we don't really earn that much money anyway. And he's probably right there. So you should really pay us a commission anyway. That's the very last I heard from him, and I'm very happy. He went to a different shop here in Brisbane who do pay him his commission. And yes, Brett and Eddie, it does happen. It did happen in the city you grew up in, and on all levels. You know, I've had there are multiple stories, but like I said, most teachers are super ethical, and this commission system seems to happen more when you get to the higher level instruments, so instruments above $10,000, $20,000, $100,000, you know, and because the commissions become quite lucrative at those kinds of price levels. But anyway, so it isn't always the teacher that initiates this. You know, some shops actually approach teachers and say, would you like a commission on my instrument sales? And it allows them to sell their instruments. Like I said, it is something I never have and never would do. That particular teacher, I recommended, look, if you really want to charge a commission, why don't you buy the instruments off me and then sell them to your student for more? You know, if you want some extra money, but please be transparent about it. I don't think he was. And that's why it's also, unless you know for sure you've got a super ethical violin maker, you know, get a second opinion, get a third opinion, and listen to that opinion. And remember, your teacher doesn't have to play that instrument. You are the person that is left with that instrument sometimes for the rest of your life. So think about that. Do you really want to hand that decision to a different person? Now, I'm not saying that connecting with the teacher and asking of their opinion isn't something you should do. You definitely should talk to your teacher. You should maybe, if you try out an instrument, you should maybe take that instrument to your lesson, or if you're trying out 2 or 3 instruments, that's even better, because then the teacher can really see which instrument you sound better on, and they can give you a really good opinion on how that instrument works for you. But when it comes to the actual workmanship and the authenticity of the instrument, most teachers obviously don't have that background. So there, you know, if you're really worried, go to a second violin maker, or possibly a third one, to get a second or third opinion. So if there was a system where there were commissions, one thing that would have to happen for this whole thing to be ethical, it would have to be totally transparent. So the teacher would say, yes, there are some wonderful instruments at this particular shop. They also give me a commission for every instrument they sell. And that way the student can make up their mind. You know, the importance of the opinion of the teacher obviously goes down a little bit, because, you know, there might be a little bit of sales in there as well. So if there was to be a system, it should be totally transparent, and everyone should know. I do understand that teachers don't always get paid the best. You know, they're musicians, and musicians don't really always get appreciated for the enormous amount of work that they put into their playing. If you think about the training, that string players have more training than doctors when they first start, you know, operating, because of the thousands of practice hours that you've put in. So the only way I think a commission system could work is if the teacher, you know, if the teacher was very open about it and basically told the student, or if the teacher wanted to buy some instruments from a shop that they think are fantastic and then sell them on to the student at a profit. But again, this should also be transparent, and the instruments should always come with a certification or valuation. Anyway, these are my stories as a violin maker. Like I said, it's not always teachers that initiate this. It's also some violin shops, because it obviously helps them sell instruments. So with the higher level instruments, that's probably more widespread than the other ones. So if you're looking at an instrument, find out if your teacher's getting commissions somehow. They might not, you know, might be very secretive about it, but somehow if a teacher's really pushing one instrument and you like a different instrument, get a second opinion, third opinion, fourth opinion. Talk to other people that might not have vested interest, because in the end, the most important thing here is that you personally find that perfect instrument. That's it. That's the most important thing, because having a really good instrument is a very big part of being a string player. And you don't want an instrument that's inferior, or end up with an instrument that you paid way too much for, and then if you want to try and upgrade to a different instrument, you actually end up only getting half or even a third of what you paid for it, which that would be just devastating. And especially seeing that most musicians aren't super wealthy. Anyway, I hope this video helps you and it sheds a bit more light on Brett and Eddie's stories, and I hope you don't ever get caught in this, and I hope you find just beautiful instruments for yourself. I've written a book on how to find a good quality instrument. It's my 7 Essentials book, 7 essential things that good instruments need to have. I've pasted the link down below just to help you out, so that you can make better choices when you buy your next instrument. Also, check out my video on fake labels. Funnily enough, I had a video all ready to post about fake labels and instruments. Excuse the silly zooms. I just got a bit excited with the zoom feature. Sorry. But yes, there I talk about instruments with fake labels, so I'll put the link in. Anyway, thanks so much, Brett and Eddie. Thank you so much for bringing that up, and I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys later. Okay, bye.